Hello again. This is another rendition of America at 250, A History of the Podcast. I'm David Blight. I'm here with Joanne Freeman and Beverly Gage. Bev this week has lectured on the very tight subjects of the whole story of World War II and anti-communism and the Cold War. So,
in 2 lectures.
In 2 lectures. But they were magnificent lectures and demonstration that it's possible to do history with such scale and with such efforts at synthesis in parts. Bev, how do you think about doing synthesis of something like World War II in one lecture? How in the world do you do that? How do we do that?
Well, I would say I think about it with some despair every time I sit down to try to do it.
Reconstruction.
And, I think the question for me is often, if we're going to draw back in the way that we have in this course, how do you find a theme that is going to be part of an ongoing conversation? And in the case of this course, a lot of it is about how the United States is conceiving of itself, what it stands for, what its central values are in these moments. And then it's hard, I would say, to find a balance between the sort of individual story, right? Often the way that people connect best with the past is through these individual stories. Right. Sure. And I'm a biographer, so I'm big on that connection.
Well, we all are.
But if you do that, then you do that too much, then you can't get at the really big scale. So I would say of everything that that I've talked about thus far, I did find these 2 weeks the global scale of World War II, having 45 minutes or 50 minutes to talk about that, and then the origins of the Cold War and the Red Scare at home. Those are big lifts.
But I do think, and John, I want to hear from you on this. I do think it is an ultimate responsibility of historians. At the end of the day, our whole craft moves towards synthesis. The world wants synthesis, different levels and scales. This is not a graduate seminar. This is a lecture course. So I think there's an obligation we have here to synthesize.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I felt the same way about, the first lecture of the course that was other than the introduction, was me talking about the American Revolution and summing it up in one lecture. And I remember sitting down to do that and thinking, that's normally a whole semester for me, but I will do it in 1 hour. But related to what you just said, Bev, it's synthesis. It's looking for a sort of broader meaning. And in a sense, related to what you just said, David, historians are particularly well qualified to offer synthesis because we're immersed in the details and the facts, and we are thus best able to step back and say, okay, now that we have all of that under control, what are the big patterns? And that's really, when we first started talking about this course.
But that's a muscle too, isn't it? I mean, our love of detail, our love of the archives works a certain set of muscles. But that muscle that we have to train to generalize when you're out speaking to a public library. And the question is, well, how did World War II transform the United States? Answer that in 5 minutes, because you have to when you're on the spot.
Well, and when it works well, it is that synthesis of teaching and research, right? They're supposed to be complementary, and in some sense, they are almost totally different creatures. But I feel that I learn a lot from this challenge of synthesis then it allows me to articulate my own research in different ways, and vice versa. I learn things in deep in the archives that then can resurface in other moments.
And having to sit down, however despairing we may feel at some point, having to sit down and actually do that by default is clarifying, right? I remember discovering when I first became a professor and I first came to Yale and I was doing my big American Revolution semester-long course, and at some early point, I can't even remember, I was lecturing about like the Boston Massacre or the Boston Tea Party or one of these iconic moments. And as I was preparing the lecture, I actually for a moment had to stop and think, what do I actually think about this? Because I knew what it was. I could have talked about what it was. But the question was, what do I actually want to say about this and what's the big so what? And it's not until my first year as a professor, but that moment when I sat down and had to do what we've been doing to prepare this course that I realized, oh, different thing, important thing. And that's part of what we give students is that kind of insight. But
maybe our final podcast should be our favorite things that we left out.
Oh, we might need two for that.
I've had a running list every time. All the things that weren't there.
Don't you feel? I
didn't do the Andrew Johnson impeachment.
I missed a whole war. I mean, I feel like a responsibility, right? Some part of me is like, I have failed history. I talked about all of these years and like, these 85 vitally important things did not get included. Can I leave this out?
But lest we lose the point of why we did this course,
yes,
we don't want to complain too much because we came together here around the assumption that a big treatment of American history was in order at this moment, this anniversary moment, and there might just be interest, and there was a lot of interest. Turns out the really thoughtful generalization is still important in history.
We said this when we met together before it all started, and there was that video of us, right? This is these kinds of anniversaries are reckoning moments, right?
Oh yeah,
and that's part of the spirit under which we came together.
So let's take up World War II for the moment. Reckoning. God, what a reckoning! A transformation of the world. Its borders, its nations, its peoples, its culture, the very idea of loss in the world. In your lecture, you divided it by who and what and how and when.
Why?
Why
is the big one.
How can I forget why? That's why we do this. Yeah, which I thought was very smart. But go back to that if you would. Here's this country. The United States was pretty isolationist in the 30s for pretty good reasons. World War I was a horrible experience for everybody. A lot of Americans thought that we should just never get involved again in entanglements abroad and everybody else's problems and so on. Internally, there was an America First movement, which was quite prominent. But then within a year or two, it's the largest mobilization the world's ever seen. How can that happen? How do you explain that? The why.
Right.
And
how. One of the things that's interesting about the Second World War is though we tend to tell it, and for very good reason, as the good war. Yeah. Right? Yeah. The war in which the United States...
We're on the side of angels.
Right. Defeated fascism, brought to... And there's a lot of truth to that. Oh, yeah. But one of the things that's interesting is how much debate there was before Pearl Harbor over precisely this why question. Why would we do this? Who will benefit? What are the aims of this? Franklin Roosevelt is trying to define that. Lots of people in American society are trying to figure that out. Now, once the war happens, it becomes one of the most popular wars in its moment in American history, and that changes dramatically and immediately with Pearl Harbor, and had been changing a little bit before that, even in that moment.
Unless we forget, Pearl Harbor was devastating. Most of the American fleet was destroyed.
And the shock of it, right? The shock of it.
Total shock.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think one of the pieces that I find particularly true of the Second World War and then of this early moment in the Cold War is the challenge of stepping back to the earlier moment and really being immersed in that, because we have such teleological stories about this. The United States was always going to enter the Second World War, was always going to fight fascism, was always going to win, and was always going to come out on the other side with this immense global footprint. And I think we have a kind of triumphalist story about the Cold War too, right? That the struggle against totalitarianism or communism or Soviet Soviet power. It all began in this moment. It was a long struggle, but then boom, in the 80s and 90s, the U.S. emerges victorious. And I think for historians and students of history, it's just so much more interesting to go back to the moments of uncertainty, which is a theme that you talked about. And you talked about,
to look
David.
forward in time instead of looking backward, right? Because to really get at the moment, you have to. And I remember in my most recent book on violence in Congress, my trick was like to pretend that I didn't know there was going to be a civil war because I had to look forward in time. And the contingency,
because they didn't.
Well, they didn't, right? And we live in a moment where it's all contingency and we don't know what's coming. And that kind of defines our experience of this time. So it's interesting.
That's part of why you may have noticed I like to assign things that are someone sitting at a moment in time trying to look at the future and trying to figure out what's coming next.
So what was your thought about assigning this book along those lines?
Right. Well, I assigned the Hayek book.
Hayek.
Yeah. So Friedrich Hayek, it's interesting because Friedrich Hayek is not an American.
He's an Austrian economist.
Right. He's Austrian. He's an economist. And he writes this book while he's in London during the war. Now, eventually he does come over to the United States and becomes one of the pivotal figures of the sort of libertarian or market-oriented conservative movement that takes off in the later part of the century.
Part of Milton Friedman's Chicago School of Economics.
Exactly. So this is a book that is going to go on to become a canonical text in that sense. And so I wanted something that would be in conversation with that conservative movement, that would be a real classic. So that's part of why nobody is going to regret having read Hayek, whether you like it or you don't like it or you argue with it or not.
You're going to have aha moments in one way or another.
And what I also thought was important is that it's 44 that he writes this. So it's this moment at the end of the war. Everybody is looking around and trying to figure out what the post-war order is going to look like. And Hayek has this very particular set of concerns in which he's saying all of these things that have been happening over the last, couple of decades in the Anglo-American world. He's writing about Britain and the United States, other places too. This buildup of state power, this turn toward the mass experience, the central planning that has come into being, and in the United States, the sort of heroic New Deal vision, the planners
which is more
will
than a
come
decade
in
old by then,
and figure this out. He's saying, wait a minute. This is actually going to lead us toward tyranny, toward serfdom, toward a renewed fascism. And actually that debate over whether fascism was a form of distorted and morphed capitalism or whether it was an expression of a certain kind of socialism, that debate goes on and on and on for decades in terms of diagnosing fascism. So I liked the uncertainty of it. It's a classic text. And I also think it's a text that has all sorts of resonances with our moment, but he's also talking about them in a different context. So I thought it might upend some people's political categories.
But that was just part of what it's all about, right? He talks about, one of the things I found fascinating in it is his talking about the fact that part of what a totalitarian regime does is change the meanings of words, right? He talks a lot. He starts out by saying, we all are going to mean different things with the word liberal, right? And I'm going to use it this way from the 19th century, and we're using it a different way in the 20th century. So that fact in and of itself, that the words and words like liberty that we take for granted actually can have many different meanings that can be deployed and manipulated in ways that really can suck a population in.
I want to back up to the war, but while we're on Hayek, it is a fierce, embrace, manifesto of individualism as a value, not just a concept, but as a way of life. And of course, it connects us back to Tocqueville, that famous section in Tocqueville where he says these Americans, they have such a depth of belief in their individualism, it becomes the habits of their heart. Hayek is arguing that that's just human nature. The 20th century had many debates. I mean, Lippmann And public opinion is a manifesto about human nature. We're all irrational, he argued, and therefore susceptible to all kinds of propaganda. The 20th century caused a collision, did it not, of every idea of modernity. And it begins to collide now with 2 world wars and a huge depression, and then further wars to come, and a tremendous fight, still not over, between ideas of democracy and ideas of communism, just to put it in a totally dichotomous way.
Well, yeah.
But that's why you gave us here 2 works of kind of intellectual history to undergird these huge conflicts of the 20th century. At least that's what I saw you doing.
Yeah. Well, I assigned Hayek in part because it's such a powerful rejoinder to the central claim of something like the New Deal, right?
Yeah.
Something like the New Deal is claiming you cannot have political liberty without economic security. And if you are poor or struggling in something like the Great Depression, obviously, you can't solve that as an individual, and security is necessary for liberty. And Hayek is coming back, and he's sort of saying, no. You actually cannot have liberty, political liberty, without also having economic liberty. So if you are not a free agent in a free market, right? If you are bound by the restrictions of government, the instructions of central planners, right? That's what's going to destroy political liberty. And so there are these 2 radically different ways of thinking about not only human nature, but actually what institutional structure allows people to be their fullest selves, to express their fullest liberties. And I think that you're right, David, in sort of thinking about the ways there are these dichotomies that emerge during this period, that people go back and forth about. World War II, certainly, but in the Cold War, and this is what I was trying to suggest a little bit in lecture, one of those is the geopolitical reality, the U.S. versus the Soviet Union. But that geopolitical reality is situated in all of these ideological debates: capitalism and communism, tyranny and democracy, individualism and collectivism, religion and atheism. And you can go on and on and on. And so it's a moment where I think politics and political action is uniquely saturated with these kind of
and
epic
they're all
ideas.
existential if you're a believer.
Right? It's a moment of isms, these grand ways of thinking. And that's part of what Hayek gets at, right? Is that there are theoretical grand ways of thinking, and then there's actually the on-the-ground reality of how these things play out.
And ironically, the grandest of all was this, frankly, utopian quest of socialism, communism, through the 20th century until the failure of the Soviet Union. And then it didn't completely fail because Vladimir Putin is trying to revive it. But less, spoiler alert maybe for our students, what a marvelous final exam question that would make. The relationship, the relationship between political and economic liberty. In the wake of the American Revolution, God knows in Reconstruction, and God knows here.
Well, Hamilton says it explicitly.
Yes.
Right? Hamilton says.
Well, so did the Radical Republicans.
Right. Hamilton says
they just failed
if you're a people who are seeking security will be all too willing to give up liberties, and they will be hard pressed to get those liberties back. It's the same kind of dichotomy.
Whereas Jefferson had all that faith in common people. They would figure out a way.
They would go the right way.
As long as they were small farmers.
And they agree with him.
I cut you off. Sorry, Bev.
Oh, I was just going to pick up on the idea of isms. And I did realize at one point that all of the seminars I teach here are isms. So I teach liberalism and conservatism. I teach communism and anti-communism.
You're a 20th century historian. You got to do the isms.
And the big isms in terms of American national identity in this moment are Americanism and un-Americanism. And that word un-American becomes so prominent. It's sort of invented in this moment and gets its political currency.
It's been revived again.
And it's comes powerful to mean so many things to so many different people. And you see a debate emerging about what in fact is American, what in fact is un-American. And then you get a bunch of really funny formulations later on in which once you're deep into the Red Scare, people begin to identify themselves as anti-communist or un-American because they're anti-communist, but they're more anti what the anti-communists are doing. And so you just see these circles going around and around and around.
Well, another thing here, and this isn't just about a final exam, but lest we forget this question of the triumphal narrative of World War II, the good war, which, is, as you say, is not without its evidence. But we have a triumphal narrative about all of American history. God knows, the founding era, the American Revolution, the legacy of the American Revolution. Of course we won the Revolution.
Well, that's where we started the course.
Yes.
Right? With me saying
of course.
The entire founding period, we see it as a series of courses.
Yeah.
And of course, we declared independence. And of course, we won the Revolution. Of course, we got a constitution. Of course.
That's teleology. That's triumphalism. That's what used to be called the Whiggish view of history. But it's all over the Civil War, too, of course. Of course the United States ended slavery. Mm-hmm. We're all abolitionists now, even though abolitionists were never more than 15%, even of abolitionist towns in upstate New York. I hope somebody accuses us of teaching against that grain at some point,
We've been interrogating it.
We surely have been interrogating it. Now, we had a question from a member of our class about how you interpreted the coming of World War II and why the United States enters it.
And the reason for it, yeah. So this is from, I do have it here, is from someone who listened to the lecture, Tuesday's lecture. And the question says, please enlarge for me, it's addressed to you, on your statement that one substantial reason for us entering World War II was that it was thought that would stimulate our industrial base. And you seem to imply that this was a widely held opinion, not limited to captains of industry. I was dismayed. Depression or not, it was hard for me to believe that Americans would gladly forfeit our soldiers' lives and treasure besides for crass industrial gain.
Professor.
Two things to say about this. So one, talking about industrial mobilization and actually industrial mobilization as the strategy of the war is a little bit different from talking about it as the motivation of the war. And so there seems to be—
Although it was happening before the war.
Right, right. That is true. But I think there's some confusion there. And
there are kinds of motivation, right?
Right. And if you watch the Why We Fight.
The Why We Fight,
exactly.
That's one of the really interesting things. You see this variety of articulations of war aims. And then, of course, there are particular military strategies that are also pretty vital when you're winning the war. So I did not mean to present a cynical view of that, but I do think it's important to be situated in the fact that the war and the Depression are just intimately tied for absolutely everyone concerned. And so those sets of questions, what is going to be the consequence of this? They last after the war. There's deep fear that once the war ends, the Depression is coming back. So I think that's one thing. The other thing that I would say about this question is that it's interesting because I was able to look at it before we all met. And it goes on to say, my father fought in the war. And I think we're entering a moment in history that is much more alive and personal and within living memory, or people know their relatives or had actual participation in these events themselves. And so there's something different about doing the history of the 20th century for all of us around now,
right?
Because we have a whole different relationship
thoroughly human
to it.
impulse.
And it obviously you can feel defensive about that for really logical reasons. But I want to go back to your earlier point just for a moment because I thought to myself, you're talking about the Depression looming large and all of these reasons why it made sense. But again, talking about contingency and putting yourself in the moment, if you're in that moment with the Depression right behind you, going into a war is not necessarily crass capitalism. It's also, what's the best way for us to serve the general good in this moment? It's not just economic. It's bigger than that. And looking back, it looks like this for sure.
Right. And in fact, Franklin Roosevelt makes the case very powerfully, both before the war and then moving on, as does Henry Luce. I mentioned his famous 1941 essay, The American Century. They both make the case that what they have learned over the last few decades is that whether you're talking about global security or you're talking about economic security and the global economy, because this is a global depression in the 30s, what they've learned is that there isn't any way for a country like the United States to survive and thrive without actually engaging with, playing a powerful role in the world, embracing a certain vision of U.S. power, because the question is here, right? Whether people want it or not, the moment has arrived. And you see lots of self-consciousness about that, and then lots of brainstorming about what that's going to mean and how to do it well.
Let's go to the heart of that if we could. Because as before with the Revolutionary era and the Civil War era and the whole latter part of the 19th century, we have this paradox again that the United States could mobilize to this almost unbelievable scale to fight fascism on two fronts. Let's not forget the Japanese were more than an authoritarian regime conquering most of Asia. That mobilization is phenomenal in world history. It doesn't happen overnight, but almost overnight. American industry is nationalized. It's converted to making guns and tanks and tons of ammunition all over the country. I grew up next to an Anderson tank plant in Flint, Michigan. There were tanks still laying there in the 1950s. At the same time, we fought with the segregated Army and Navy. We took our racial apartheid with us all over the globe and did it anyway. How do you explain the why of that mobilization? Was it, again, the nature of the enemy, an existential threat from two enemies now, one that had directly attacked us and the other that declared war almost immediately when they got the chance? Is that what it is? Is it existential threat that led to this kind of mobilization, or is it something else? Or was it the clever manipulation of the Roosevelt administration, which was building destroyers and kind of trading them with the Brits for 2 and 3 years before Pearl Harbor?
Does it have to be either or, though?
No, we don't believe in either ors, do we, in history? No, we really don't.
No.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And I think manipulation might be
That's
too
a little
strong
hard.
word
Yeah,
in
that's
any
true.
case.
That's true.
But this question
And I'm an FDR lover. Don't forget that. So.
But the question of race and the Second World War, I think, is a really interesting one. So the United States mobilizes, as you say, as a segregated army. We have Japanese internment at home. We've coming out of this period of the 20s into the 30s, where ideas about racial hierarchy have been very prominent in American life. But the war is really a catalyst for beginning to change that in a bunch of different ways. So one, I think many Americans understood what they were fighting as these totalitarian fascist regimes that were built around visions of racial purity. And that is one of the things, right, that the Japanese regime and the Germans, they have in common these ideas. Now, they have different racial hierarchies, but they nonetheless have these ideas about racial purity and racial domination that obviously result in Germany in the tragedy of the Holocaust, in the Pacific War, take a somewhat different form. And that's really powerful and really shocking to many Americans, goes a long way for good reason to discredit some of those ideas as they existed in the United States. And then you also had, coming out of the 30s, a kind of racial liberalism that you hear expressed. It's part of what we listened to Paul Robeson's Ballad for Americans today. And it has a whole section where it says, "What am I? An American. I'm an, Irish, Negro." Exactly. And so you do have these visions that are about a kind of integrationism, a kind of racial liberalism that's going to have dramatic effects after the war. The U.S. Army does desegregate in 1948, and we see, of course, some of the stirrings of the civil rights
by
movement
executive order, not by act of Congress, which was another story we can take ahead. But yes, and you pointed out at the beginning of the Ropes and Song today that he first performed that as part of the Federal Theater Project, which was a federal effort to employ artists. And it became
I think technically it was in the Federal Theater Project, and then the Federal Theater Project got shut down, and then he did his radio broadcast. So I'm not sure the exact
order.
Shut down for being too radical and communist by the Dies Committee. Anyway, which is itself phenomenal. The federal government began to create art, and a lot of it became edgy, to say the least, and radical. What did they expect? But anyway, okay, in the middle of this massive war, on a scale no one could ever have imagined, that will lead to destruction of city after city after city in Europe and in Asia. Millions of people will die, far more Russians than anybody else. The United States is building already a national security state because it has to. It has to. It's militarizing and mobilizing the nation state, and Washington, D.C. was rebuilt in World War II.
That's an important point that I want to touch on before you go on, which is just they have to, right? So getting away from motive and strategy, it's also given
necessity.
Yes, exactly. It's necessity given the circumstances on the ground and where things are. That has to happen, and that has to be woven in here as well.
Oh, it does. And they rebuild Washington, D.C. because they kind of have to. They got all these new agencies now. They got all these new, all the alphabet soup now. They all have to have buildings, and from the New Deal on. So what is this thing called the national security state? And, of course, it's going to inform everything we learn about the Cold War. What is it actually at its heart?
Well, so one thing that's interesting is that word security, which was one of the buzzwords of the 1930s, and then we moved from social security to national security. Right. But they're both these big state-building projects. Right. And I think, again, it's hard to remember just how much that had to be invented in that moment. The United States had no intelligence service. Right. They had to basically beg the British to come over and train American spies and intelligence officials in 1939, 40, 41.
Brits were breaking codes, and we didn't know how to do it, right?
Right. I mean, there is a little piece of military intelligence at that point. The FBI is trying to do this, but when you look at, as I was writing about Hoover, it was fascinating because they're all writing back to each other, sort of saying, uh-oh, we've just been charged with keeping track of espionage, sabotage, subversion, and how do you do that? And so it's this very rapid scaling up, and it's a very rapid learning curve. And I think one of the things that's interesting about the Second World War is, wars come, you have big mobilizations, and this is certainly one of them, and lots of learning. And after earlier wars, you mostly then demobilized. And there's a little bit of that. And there are moves to do that. Certainly many, many, many millions of men moved out of the armed services. But and
they had babies.
That's right.
The baby boom
many
generation.
Of them, like David Blight.
Yes. They had a lot of babies. Yeah.
But the thing that happens then very rapidly after this war is a reconceiving of this state of war as being something that's going to be semi-permanent.
And isn't that partly because, as you mentioned in lecture, right? It's partly because of the comparison and contrast with the rest of the world, right? Because we emerge from that and we're like, oh, we're powerful. We have all of this industry. The world has been wrecked in a variety of ways, and here we are. So that's a new sort of self-conception. And at some point, not necessarily now, but at some point I want to come back to, you talked about, maybe in our last conversation here, you talked about self-consciousness or self-awareness, and that plays an interesting role in American history given our sort of deliberate start. I'm throwing that out there because I think at some point we should come back to that idea. But this plays into that as well.
Well, I will say briefly for now that this is a moment of deep self-consciousness. I mentioned that this is the moment this academic discipline called American Studies is born because suddenly the country is like, oh, we have to figure out what's American and what's not American and what makes us special and what makes us different. It is a kind of high moment of American exceptionalism, but it's also this big moment of American anxiety. And you see it in all sorts of realms. Like Americans are worried that like actually American culture isn't as good as European culture, or that actually—
Which goes all the way back.
Right.
Just to my guys.
American education is not as good. Like we're not as smart and we're not as sophisticated and all of those things. And so a lot of these are security concerns and geopolitics, but it's also this fascinating moment of kind of cultural renegotiation and ambition.
Right.
Yeah.
And the Cold War has a whole cultural agenda. It creates the Fulbright program, which sends Americans all over the world and people from all over the world here. They created the American Studies Center in Salzburg, Austria.
Right. The CIA is funding all sorts of little pro-democracy magazines. The Paris Review gets money from the CIA.
Voice of America, which is, I guess, now being destroyed.
Or has it already been destroyed?
Well, I think that it's under attack. But the Voice of America, headquartered for years and years in Munich, Germany, was an American propaganda machine, as well as a source of American culture, all kinds.
Yeah.
I mean,
well,
it had a jazz station that went all over Europe.
Not to jump too far ahead, but I do think one of the things that we're seeing in our own moment, and not just this year, but over the last 10 years or so, is a rethinking of, a dismantling of certain parts of that Cold War state that was built. The Cold War investment in science and universities, the existence of NATO, right? We've seen the Department of the Department of War in the 40s became the Department of Defense and now is going back. So there's a whole renegotiation underway about these institutions that were born in this very particular moment.
And related to that, and in the same pattern that we're talking about here. And along with it, a real reexamination, deliberate or otherwise, about who we are and what we should be in this kind of moment. You know, another one of those perhaps not musing kind of moments, but a moment in which those kinds of big questions are
well, and maybe
right in front of us.
nothing caused that big question. Who are we? Quite like anti-communism. I mean, I grew up with that. You know, commie. Well, you grew up with the word commie.
Yeah.
Maybe Bev's too young. I don't know. but okay, let's talk about that since it was the central theme of today's lecture. How did that come about? I mean, it's there, as you pointed out in your lecture, long before Joe McCarthy made it his own shtick. Where does this come from? Does it come from the Bolshevik Revolution? Does it come out of the 30s Depression? I mean, because by the mid to late 1940s, it's the most important question in American politics, and almost everybody is anti-communist.
Well, and it, as you just said, and it never fully goes away. It's now become like I mentioned earlier, right? Words lose meanings, or words get warped meanings, and then words just become buzzwords. And now, you know, commie has become a meaningless thing that you sort of throw off at people. But this is the moment when it emerges in that.
Yeah, well, undergraduates who are interested in this question, I'm teaching a whole class about this next semester. It's called The Un-American Century. It is a partner to my survey course that is The American Century. But it really is to get at this set of questions. There are lots of strains of anti-communism, anti-socialism that go way, way back, well into the 19th century. But what happens in the 40s in particular is that it becomes the lingua franca of American politics. Right? The things start getting divided into American and un-American. And the way you know what's American is that it is not communist, it's not Soviet, it's not socialist.
Collectivist.
It's not collectivist. It's not all of these isms and ists. And that's something different because it is the reigning logic of American politics, really for the second half of the 20th century, and everything from, how the FBI and the CIA are organized to whether or not we can have national health insurance to civil rights to women's rights, right? They all become wrapped up in this question of communism,
socialized medicine has
anti-communism.
been one of the most common epithets of my lifetime. Oh, that would be socialized. No, it just means you have national health insurance.
That comes from the battles of the late
Absolutely,
1940s when they were actually
Yes.
proposing national health insurance and then failing to get
It had a religious, you pointed that out in a lecture, it had a religious element too.
You can almost describe this as America's quote-unquote civic religion in its own right. But it is also true that the 40s and 50s produced a huge wave of church-going in order, in some ways, to perform the fact that you were not communist, you were not leftist. So there was a public aspect to that. It leads to the invention of this thing called the Judeo-Christian tradition, which is supposed to bring together Jews and Catholics and Protestants all as being within the American category in a way that we saw in the teens and 20s. It wasn't so clear that, Jews and Catholics were full Americans. Well, by the 40s and 50s, they are, but one of the things that is really binding people together in that kind of logic is this opposition to atheistic communism.
And it affected everything and everybody. I'm remembering, Reinhold Niebuhr, one of the greatest theologians of American history, Protestant theologian, writes his famous book, The Irony of American History, about the Cold War and how the Cold War had now forced this confrontation with certain values and beliefs, everything.
A confrontation that is given mythic proportions. Right? That's the thing. It's not just a ground level political strategic thing now. It's become a way of life versus a way of life and according to the thinking of the time, a different set of morals, which is where religion comes in. It becomes kind of an epic opposition.
And communists would make you atheist and destroy individualism.
And these are not just a set of cultural ideas or political ideas, right? The Republicans are accusing the Democrats of being soft on communism, and the Democrats are defending themselves and separating themselves from the Communist Party and things that are too far left. But the Red Scare itself is all about not only these cultural and political and even geopolitical swirls, but about the ways that these become ideas that are enforced, right? And they are enforced through some pretty brutal mechanisms, mechanisms of public interrogation and humiliation before the Congress, prosecutions, blacklisting, surveillance, investigation. And in some cases, that was for quite good reason, which is to say that the Communist Party did take money from the Soviet Union. They did run Soviet espionage.
There was a real Communist Party in the United States.
They did run real espionage networks, and many people, Paul Robeson included, were real Stalinists, right? I mean, they really thought that stuff was great. And then in other cases, these really pretty draconian methods are targeting people who express some vague left-wing idea, who put their name on the wrong kind of petition. And so when we talk about the Red Scare, it's about that really repressive moment of which my dear friend J. Edgar Hoover is really the architect, but Joe McCarthy has lived on as our kind of
he's the
icon
performative
of it. He's the performer, and Hoover's the institution man and the enforcer.
And it affected millions who might have been simply a liberal professor of literature in a university, or a musical performer somewhere, or a Hollywood producer who were in the arts, and their politics might have been secondary to what they did anyway. But it did affect everybody. And one lesson in this, which is one of those things historians do at the end of the day too, is that it's easy to be cynical about anti-communism now, and it was through a lot of my life. You could always come up with jokes about how silly anti-communism became, and yet it came from somewhere. And that's kind of what you were doing here, I think, in these two lectures.
The crises of the 1940s. You've just come out of a global cataclysm,
And
60 million people dead.
And the United States not only survived, it rules the world now, if it wants to.
Right, but then new crises emerge immediately, right?
And we're still reckoning with who we are.
Yeah.
On a certain level, we're big, we're powerful. We came out of that crisis.
We always win. Oh, gosh, Vietnam, we didn't.
Exactly. I think you had this great, you said, I'm not going to be able to get it here. You said there was like a string of things that came one after another after another. You had sort of Korea thrown in there, right? All one after another, that all in one way or another still, as long as you have anti-communist fear, you're still reckoning with who we are. Because that's one way of just saying them and us and drawing a line.
Well, and there's a certain romanticism now, actually, looking back on, I guess there aren't that many people who are romantic about the Red Scare in particular, though actually it too still has many, many defenders. Joe McCarthy has plenty of defenders, even in our own moment.
And Roy Cohn, his chief advisor, has had remarkable influence on a certain modern president. But
that is true. That is true. There are direct lines to be drawn there as well. But what I was going to say is that there is, in some parts of our own discourse, a kind of romanticism about the clear dualities of the Cold War and how clarifying they were and how they gave a sense of purpose and they forced bipartisanship and they had all of these kind of virtuous outcomes. And I don't think that's a great description of the Cold War. And but there is a language out there that's like, actually, it would be great if we got into a new Cold War because it would be
clarifying and unifying, right? But wars do things. That gets us back to Hayek, right? Wars force a certain kind of thinking. Wars cause, what he would have called planning, but wars cause this kind of group manipulation thinking because it's necessary. And then when the war is over, the question is what comes next?
Well, we should probably finish up. So maybe I will do what comes next. Yeah. So I fear that the challenge that we started with, which is the challenge of synthesis, is only going to get worse next week, which is to say there are 3 lectures left in the 20th century. One of them
up the 20th
is going to look at the sort of left and liberal movements of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And the other is going to look at the conservative movements of the 50s, 60s, and 70s and into the 80s. So that's all in 2 lectures next week. Then we're going to get 1 lecture on how the Cold War came to an end and the politics of the 90s and what came after. And then it's our last lecture. Well, we're almost. Yeah. I'm going to sum up the second half of the 20th century in basically 3 lectures. So wish me luck.
But there are going to be 3 tremendous lectures based on the last 4 we've heard. There's an old folk song called "The 20th Century is Almost Over." Almost over. But it's not almost over. We got 3 whole lectures to come. And God knows we got rock and roll yet to come. We got...
Yeah, the music only gets better.
The music only gets better.
We were talking about this at lunch, right? No shortage of good music. So,
and the paradoxes and contradictions only get deeper.
And the familiarity will grow for people as well.
Oh, the memory history line.
We're moving into remembered
memory
past.
History. The history beyond your memory, and now it's memory all mixed up in your history. Always a risky thing. Don't trust your memory.
Trust historians.
Trust historians. That's why we have historians. It's to mess with your memory. No, not really. Well, again, we're coming to the end of another podcast. This was great. Thank you, Bev. Thank you, Joanne. And tune in again next week, where we'll be surging into the 1960s and 70s, I think.
You don't want to miss it.
You don't want to miss it. Thank you all for tuning in. See you next time.